The first impression was light, radiant, shifting, uncontained by any known spectrum. It wasn't the warmth of sunlight or the sterile glow of artificial bulbs. It shimmered, oscillating between hues of molten gold, cold silver, and deep sapphire, as though the air itself had taken on a sentient, breathing pulse of color. The soldier's arrival was silent, his boots sinking soundlessly into the crystalline surface beneath him. A terrain both alien and pristine, untouched by tread or time. Around him stretched a world that defied terrestrial vocabulary. Floating cities suspended mid-air. Translucent towers that twisted skyward like frozen light beams and bridges that shimmered with invisible motion. No wind stirred, yet the structures moved subtly, pulsing like the synchronized breath of a living planet. The man moved slowly, adjusting the grip on his weapon as if it could anchor him in this sea of impossibility. He had been deployed under strict orders, anomalous signals, cryptic interference, strange readings in a quiet sector of deep space. The coordinates had led them here to a world unnamed and unreadable. Moments after touchdown, the rest of his unit had vanished, not in violence, not in blood, but as if swallowed by the very air, leaving him utterly alone with his breath echoing in his helmet and his heartbeat in his ears. The landscape wrapped around him like a dream only half remembered, dazzling in its impossibility. Towering spires refracted the ethereal light in all directions, and what appeared to be floating walkways curled into loops with no visible support. There was an overwhelming sense of purpose to it all. Nothing appeared accidental. The geometry bent, but never broke the chaos disguised as harmony, the silence carrying intent. Though his visor detected no movement, the feeling of being observed clung to him, subtle, pervasive, like the aftertaste of static electricity. He moved forward one slow step at a time, every nerve alert despite the strange calm saturating the environment. With each step, the ground gave a faint pulse beneath him, a barely perceptible rhythm that seemed to align with his own. The sensation was not aggressive. If anything, it felt familiar. As though the world recognized him, as though it was waking up. Then sound came, not as noise but as resonance. It began low deep in the bones like a vibration that shook his core rather than pierced his ears. It rose gradually, building in layers harmonic and dissonant at once until it filled the space like a choral tide. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so. The kind of beauty that hinted at power far beyond comprehension. A beauty that did not ask for permission to exist. Through the refracted light and vibration, a form emerged. It did not walk, it simply became visible, stepping forward from between two shimmering monoliths with an elegance that made the alien spires seem crude by comparison. The entity before him was humanoid, but only in silhouette. The details betrayed something beyond any known biology. Her skin, or what passed for it, glimmered like nacre mother of pearl lit from within. Her body moved as if sculpted from liquid light, too precise to be accidental, too symmetrical to be natural. Her eyes bore the gravity of ancient oceans, their irises in constant flux between opalescent white and deep violet. Everything about her exuded gravity, not mass, but influence, a pull that seemed to distort the space between them. As she moved closer, the air grew heavier, fragrant with a blend of metallic sweetness and an underlying ozone charge. The air around her shimmered like heat mirage, not from warmth but from force. Her presence bent the reality he knew. He could feel the core of his being responding not in fear, but in some deeper recognition. His mind rebelled against the lack of logic, but his instincts whispered of significance. The way her gaze locked onto him, unwavering and curious, bypassed thought entirely and pressed directly against his consciousness. She didn't seem surprised to see him. If anything, she seemed expectant, as though his arrival had been anticipated, not predicted, but arranged. There was no sound now, only her steps, her breath, and the shimmer of her aura pressing against the silence. She motioned slightly, not with command, but with inevitability. He followed without speaking, unsure if he still could. Words had dissolved somewhere between the resonance and her eyes. What remained was movement. Together, they walked across a sky bridge that hovered above the crystalline landscape. Beneath them, rivers of light flowed like plasma, threading through the landscape in erratic pulses. The entire world seemed to be humming now, responding to their movement, or perhaps only to hers. It was unclear whether she was leading him or merely allowing him to follow. Every structure they passed reacted in subtle ways, rippled with color, vibrated gently, or emitted brief flashes of symbolic light that vanished before he could decipher them. This wasn't a city, he began to realize. It was a system, a construct, a living mechanism whose purpose escaped understanding. And he was inside it now, a foreign cell in a perfect organism. Ahead rose a sphere suspended midair, its surface rippling like water, and yet holding form like steel. As they approached, the orb opened along a seam, revealing a glowing interior flooded with amber light and soft gravitational pressure. She entered without hesitation. He stepped inside, and the sensation was immediate. Gravity turned to suggestion walls, expanded into apparent infinity, and time seemed to slow, not stop, but loosen its grip. Within the sphere were suspended platforms, each rotating slowly and housing holographic images of impossible complexity. Cities under twin suns, bioluminescent forests, ancient monoliths being erected by multi-limbed beings. A repository of history not stored, but alive. The archive breathed. He stood at the center, absorbing fragments he could not hope to understand. Images brushed past his awareness, scenes of triumph, catastrophe, ritual, and migration. The scale was incomprehensible. Each image told not just of a people, but of a philosophy. There were symbols, glyphs, layered in ways that refused linear interpretation, spiraling outward in recursive geometry. The sphere wasn't just a vault of memory. It was a lens, a filter, a trial. Then the rhythm shifted. The images glitched, stuttering for half a breath. A pulse of crimson energy radiated from the platform to his left, the only jarring note in the orchestra of light and symmetry. The entity beside him, he knew now she was no emissary, no scout, but sovereign, reacted immediately. Her stillness broke. She turned, and her expression darkened, though her grace never faltered. The anomaly grew. The harmony of the sphere fractured, turning turbulent. A tremor passed through the archive like a system in distress. The queen moved with sudden urgency, approaching the source, her iridescent glow dimming fractionally as the crimson light grew brighter. The sphere itself responded, its inner walls contracting as though bracing for impact. The ambient hum turned into a warning. She moved toward him then, not with the elegance of invitation, but the force of command. She reached out, touched his arm, and the reaction was immediate heat pressure, a flash of insight he couldn't interpret. Then came motion. She pulled him from the archive and back into the sky, the world outside now transformed. Where once the landscape had pulsed with serenity, now it buckled under unseen stress. The bridges cracked, the towers bent inward, and the floating cities tilted like ships listing at sea. The harmony had been broken. The dream was breaking apart. The queen's posture was tense now, her movements faster, more direct. She did not flee, but she maneuvered, guiding him through collapsing corridors of light, past ruptured walkways and around falling shards of crystalline architecture. Every breath felt borrowed. The pulse beneath their feet no longer matched his rhythm. It was erratic, alarmed. Then came the sound, a guttural rising growl that shattered whatever illusions of safety remained. From the periphery emerged a figure not humanoid, not bestial, but something primal, carved from the absence of light. It moved with purpose, each step triggering microquakes. Its armor shifted like liquid obsidian, and its gaze locked onto them with instinctive violence. It was ancient, it was awakened, it was wrong. The queen moved between him and the creature. Her body, radiant seconds before, now glowed with the flickering pulse of energy on the edge of collapse. She raised her arms, and from her palms surged a wave of force that struck the guardian like thunder made solid. It staggered but did not fall. It recoiled but did not yield. She turned her urgency, now laced with finality, and pushed him toward a structure at the edge of the collapsing city, a monolith pulsing with a steady crimson beat. He ran. The monolith stood unmarred amidst the collapse, a towering crimson beacon pulsing with rhythmic certainty, as though it alone defied the chaos unraveling around it. His steps pounded against fractured walkways and shifting terrain dust rising in waves behind him, while the thunder of pursuit roared ever closer. The city, once immaculate and incomprehensible, now cracked open like an overripe fruit, its innards exposed, collapsing under the strain of forces it had long kept dormant. Through the cacophony of grinding metal and fracturing crystal, he reached the base of the structure. Its surface was smooth, featureless at first glance, but as he approached, subtle glyphs revealed themselves glowing faintly beneath his fingertips. The pulse of the monolith synchronized with his chest, strong, slow, inevitable. Without waiting, the surface parted like liquid glass, drawing him inside in a seamless transition from terror to stillness. The world outside vanished in a silent implosion of light. What greeted him next was not darkness but depth, an endless cavern of motionless color. No gravity, no up or down, only directionless space that pulsed with silent abstract intelligence. For a moment he floated disoriented, unable to tell whether he was falling, rising, or simply suspended in being. Then, as if responding to that uncertainty, the world reassembled itself. The ground formed beneath his feet firm but alien, soft to the touch, yet unyielding. Trees rose around him crystalline and weightless, their limbs swaying without wind. The sky spun in slow spirals above clouds of molten light, rotating like galaxies, every detail constructed with exaggerated perfection. This new world was a place between places, a seam in reality, a sanctum. The air here vibrated gently, tingling against his skin as if it were alive. The landscape shifted as he moved. Hills swam rather than rolled, their surfaces shimmering with oily luminescence. Flowers opened as he passed their petals, refracting light into unfamiliar constellations. Every step forward carried the sensation of descending further inward, not deeper into the world, but deeper into the self. The space was reflective in a way that had nothing to do with mirrors. It bent back perception, made every glance a confrontation. It was not meant for wandering, but for reckoning. Then it happened. A presence formed before him, familiar yet impossible. It bore his face, his uniform, even the same weariness etched into the corners of his eyes. Yet something was distinctly wrong. The reflection stood too still, its gaze too calm, its expression too empty. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same crimson as the monolith, as though something ancient looked out through them. The copy moved in perfect silence, lips parting, though no words emerged through the air. Instead, understanding poured directly into his consciousness. Images, feelings, memories, not entirely his own. It was like being spoken to from within. The entity was not just an imitation, it was potential made manifest. A version of himself carved from decisions not yet made. It spoke of choices, of powers buried deep, of ancient fragments that had fused unknowingly into his essence the moment he entered this realm. The truth spilled forth like a current. There had once been a being immense, eternal, and unbound, whose existence stretched across realities. It had been neither god nor demon, but possibility incarnate. The ancients called it Ethereum. It could build galaxies or unmake entire systems with a single breath. Its power was beyond morality, a raw, primordial truth. Fearing its dominance, the guardians of countless worlds had shattered it, scattering its essence across dimensions, burying the fragments in deep space, in dead worlds, in living conduits, unaware of their roles. He had become one such vessel. The signals that brought his team here were not calls for help or warnings, but echoes, fragments of Ethereum stirring within him, reacting to proximity. The monolith had responded not because it recognized him, but because he belonged to it. The awakening of the fragment had ruptured the fragile balance of this alien sanctuary, triggering ancient defenses like the Guardian, now hunting them. And the Queen she had known. Not fully perhaps, but instinctively. From the moment her gaze met his, she had sensed the resonance. The realization was suffocating. He wasn't an intruder, he was a catalyst. The images around him shifted. The utopia darkened. The sky grew bruised and sickened. The trees twisted into mockeries of life, the light bled into corruption. The monolith, once steady and pure, now beat erratically in the distance, its glow guttering like a dying flame. Shadows coalesced around the dreamscape, taking shapes of cities, decayed beings deformed, and worlds sundered. The doppelganger extended a hand, and the future played out before him, a vision of collapse, not just of this world, but of all others touched by the fragments. Without guidance, the fragment would grow. Without containment, it would seek reunion. The reunion would not restore but consume, destruction cloaked as transcendence. And yet there was a path, not forward but inward. The copy faded, leaving behind only the clarity of necessity. The choice was not one of power, but of intention. The fragment could not be removed, but it could be channeled, shaped, directed. The price would be identity, a surrender of control to gain mastery. A soldier's path no longer applied. Orders would not suffice. Understanding had to be earned. Then another presence reached him, distant but urgent. It was not a call through space, but through resonance. Familiar, melodic. The Queen. She had survived. Somehow she remained intact in the chaos outside. Her voice vibrated through the dream space, not in syllables, but in frequency. She called him back, not just in body, but in essence. The fragment responded to her. It stirred at her signal. She had become his anchor. He turned toward the glowing trails that lined the landscape, those strange floating outlines that had shimmered around him since the beginning. They pulsed brighter now, like veins of light in a darkening body, each one a pathway through layers of unreality. He reached out, hand brushing the nearest line, and the dream dissolved again. But this time, he was not cast adrift. This time he surrendered to the current. The world reconstituted itself with force. The air was colder now, sharper, tinged with ash and ozone. He emerged into a city crumbling under its own weight. The towers were split, their crystalline cores fractured and leaking radiant mist. The pulsing ground was erratic and jagged, every surface cracked by energy released in haste. The Guardian's wrath echoed through the sky in pulses of seismic aggression. And then he saw her. She stood among the rubble, her aura dimmed, body lined with fractal burns of energy, but still radiant with command. The Queen remained unbroken, even as the world around her fell into ruin. She turned toward him as though she had seen his return long before it happened. The expression she wore was not surprise. It was relief, tempered by urgency. He moved to her faster now, feet bleeding across debris, lungs burning with effort. She reached out to steady him, and the moment their skin met the fragment inside him, surged like a pulse of liquid fire. It recognized her touch, not as threat, not as restraint, but as balance. She guided him to a structure still standing, though barely a sanctuary, untouched by corruption, shielded by layers of force woven in sacred geometry. Its surface rippled in soft golden light. They entered together. The air changed immediately, turning warm and still like the breath of a sleeping world. This place was old. It was not built. It had been grown. Inside, the symbols carved into the walls told stories in light arcs of truth spiraling through time. He saw himself again, this time not as a soldier, not as a vessel, but as a choice. A living crossroad. The sanctuary did not judge, it simply revealed. And so he sat. He surrendered the weapon. He placed his palms against the carved stone and let the resonance build. The fragment inside him responded not with violence, but with recognition. The presence of the Queen steadied the chaos like gravity around a star. Together they formed a system. The sanctuary pulsed once, then again. And for the first time since arrival, the hum of the world realigned with the beat of his heart. The sanctuary welcomed the resonance, not as an intruder, but as a return. Its walls, etched with knowledge predating language, responded to the presence of the fragment now stirring within him. The Queen stood nearby. Her breath measured her posture, composed but not relaxed. She was a figure suspended between regality and urgency, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the invisible horizon of consequence. The soft glow of the chamber deepened, casting shifting patterns across the floor like reflections from water untouched by wind. Time folded in this space. Not halted, not slowed, but reconfigured. The past did not remain behind him, nor the future ahead. Both curled inward, pulled toward the moment, like iron, toward a singular magnetic point. He sat with palms pressed to stone, sensing a current weaving upward from beneath the surface. Threads of memory origin and transformation rising to meet him. The fragment, long buried beneath layers of function and identity, expanded slowly, cautiously. It did not invade, it unfolded. Images took form behind closed eyes. They began as impressions, flashes of dark suns and spinning pillar shapes that resisted geometry. Then came formed civilizations, standing like sentinels beneath skies ribboned with energy entities, of impossible scale, drifting between stars, as if they were stepping stones. The presence known as Ethereum had once moved through these realities freely, not as a ruler but as a tide carving purpose, where there was none erasing what failed to harmonize. It had not loved nor hated, it had shaped. He was witnessing more than history. He was inhabiting it. Each memory was not told but relived. He felt the tremor of planets splitting open, the silence of creation stilled in thought, the unbearable density of pure potential waiting for form. Then the resistance began, a coalition of minds across galaxies, unwilling to be sculpted. The sealing followed ritual and science fused into a single act of desperation. Ethereum had been divided, shattered into conceptual shards, and scattered where no single path could reconnect them. And yet against all calculation, the impossible had happened. One such shard drifting across epochs had found purchase in the structure of his being. Not by selection, not by targeting, but by resonance, some essential alignment between fragment and host, and the queen she had known from the instant they touched. Not the full extent, but the gravity of it. She had known what the fragment meant, and what it could mean again if left untended. As the memory faded, he opened his eyes, and the sanctuary responded. The light dimmed to a calm glow. The air was steady now. The fragment within him was no longer quaking. It was listening. The queen approached, her movements more fluid now, no longer driven by crisis but by intent. She extended a hand, not to command or contain, but to complete. The contact formed a conduit. Her aura brushed his consciousness like silk soaked in starlight. Their energies folded into each other, not merging, not losing individuality, but creating a third presence between them, an overlap, a synthesis. Together, they turned toward the sanctuary's core. A raised platform sat within a ring of floating stones, each inscribed with shifting glyphs. The symbols moved as they neared, reconfiguring themselves to match his presence. The queen guided him to the center, then withdrew slightly, forming a silent perimeter as the glyphs began to rise and orbit his form. The air thickened. The platform activated. From below, a column of translucent energy rose, encasing him in a shell of vibrating stillness. It was neither prison nor shield, but a crucible. The glyphs circled faster, each one vibrating with a frequency that triggered forgotten aspects of his being. Instincts that had no origin in his life. Emotions tied to lifetimes never lived. The fragment reacted, stirring like a vast organ being awakened after centuries of silence. It did not fight him. It waited. Then came the test. The sanctuary projected simulations, not illusions, but entire possibilities. Each one played out in full around him. In one, he surrendered the fragment, allowing it to dissolve into pure energy, harmless, but wasted. The world was saved, but the cosmos remained stagnant, locked in entropy. In another, he embraced its full power, becoming a being of light and command, only to collapse the reality around him in spirals of unintended devastation. In a third, he gave it away to another, to many. The fragment replicated, spreading like spores, sparking brief golden ages that always ended in collapse. The simulations came faster. Dozens, then hundreds. Some ended in fire, others in silence. Some offered triumph, always at cost. Some gave peace, but peace built on a lie. None were perfect. All required something essential: sacrifice, surrender, solitude, suffering. There was no path through this that allowed him to return unchanged. He saw himself lose his name. He saw himself become myth. He saw himself broken, mended, abandoned, elevated, erased. He saw lives spun from the choices he had not yet made. It was not the future that broke him, but the weight of choice itself. The fragment did not offer certainty. It only amplified consequence. The column of light dimmed. The glyphs slowed. The queen stepped forward again, her expression unreadable. She extended her hand once more, and this time the platform receded. The test was done. The sanctuary had not judged, it had simply shown. The decision remained his. They left the sanctuary together, re-entering the fractured city. The chaos had not lessened. The sky remained torn by rifts of colorless light. The ground ruptured in a spiderweb of fractures that glowed with warning. The Guardian still hunted. He could feel its proximity like pressure in the bones, each step of its colossal form warping the terrain. But now something had changed. He no longer moved as prey. The fragment within him was no longer dormant. It was poised, ready. Not to unleash destruction, but to rewrite interaction. The world around him was not a threat to evade, it was a system to be rewritten, reoriented. The Queen turned toward him, her gaze steady, her shoulders lifted not in command, but in trust. She would not lead, not now. He was no longer to be led. The Guardian appeared. It moved with impossible force, cracking stone and space alike. Its limbs were covered in plates that shimmered like broken mirrors, and its eyes burned with ancient purpose. Yet this time he did not raise his weapon. He stepped forward with nothing but intent. The ground beneath him responded, humming in perfect resonance. The fragment pulsed in his chest, not like a foreign entity, but like a second heart, ancient and clear. He extended both hands not to attack, but to receive. The air around him shifted, geometry folded, time paused. The Guardian halted. A resonance passed between them. Not words, not meaning, but recognition. The Guardian trembled. Then it knelt. The Queen moved to his side, and together they approached. The Guardian bowed its head, its form fracturing slowly into waves of crystal light. It did not vanish. It returned to the pattern, to the balance. The threat had not been destroyed. It had been rewritten. He had not conquered the fragment. He had harmonized. The Guardian dissolved into a lattice of flickering light, each shard folding itself into the fractured ground with reverence rather than retreat. No cry marked its end. No tremor signaled collapse. It was not defeated. It had been released. The pattern of the world recalibrated silently, as if the land had merely been waiting for the proper frequency to resume its rhythm. He stood in stillness at the epicenter breath, steady, no longer overwhelmed, but aligned. The fragment within him, once a volatile presence, now beat with quiet power, a harmonic undercurrent rather than a consuming tide. Around them, the broken city began to stir. Not rebuild, not yet, but acknowledge. Cracked towers whispered with faint luminescence. Bridges that had collapsed into dust sent out slender filaments of crystal, feeling their way back toward cohesion. The skies, once slashed with sickened energy, now shimmered with threads of iridescent renewal. It was not healing. It was readiness. The Queen stepped beside him, her figure radiant again, though not as it had been before. She too had changed. Her aura, once a shield between her and all others, had thinned, allowing vulnerability to shine through not weakness, but honesty. The energies between them braided together without touch, a gravitational intimacy born not from romance, but from resonance. They were no longer strangers. They were now each other's reference point in a world that had nearly forgotten its symmetry. Together they walked through the transformed ruins. With every step, the city grew more alive, not by reconstruction, but by acceptance. This was no return to a previous order. This was an emergence into a new geometry, one recalculated by presence rather than design. The alien systems that once rejected his existence now formed around him in measured trust. Not as a king, not as a god, as an axis. At the city's edge rose the monolith dimmer now, its urgency spent, its purpose fulfilled. It no longer pulsed with warning or beckoning. Instead, it radiated stillness. It was now a beacon not for entry, but for memory. He approached it, and the crimson glow brushed his skin like a farewell. The monolith had opened the way. Now it would wait again. Beyond it lay the horizon, uncharted, untouched. Not a return to the world he came from, but a threshold to the world that now awaited him. The sky beyond the city no longer shimmered in chaos. It breathed with layered clouds and quiet depth. The stars no longer screamed, they whispered. The signals that once brought him here had ceased. Not because they were silenced, but because their purpose had passed. He had arrived, and he had changed the note. Still, the question of return lingered. His former world remained somewhere across immeasurable distance, orders left behind, comrades unaccounted for, systems still clinging to a universe of logic and containment. Yet standing here with the fragment woven into the root of his being return had become an abstraction. The version of himself that had boarded the mission shuttle, that had set foot on this impossible terrain with a weapon in hand and doubt in his blood, no longer existed. What remained was presence reshaped by truth beyond definition. The Queen gestured toward a new path forming in the distance, one the city itself now revealed. It was not marked by structure or light, but by rhythm, a pulse low and steady forming a corridor of trust. He turned toward her and she toward him. No words passed between them, none were needed. They understood the same gravity now. The sanctuary they had shared was no longer confined to the structure beneath the ground. It moved with them. It existed wherever balance was invited, and so they stepped into the path side by side. The terrain shifted gently underfoot. With each step, the world reconfigured itself in response. Trees with trunks like braided light arched overhead, their leaves vibrating like translucent chimes. Pools of liquid silver lay calm beside them, each surface reflecting not their forms, but their intentions. The air grew warmer, more resonant. The further they walked, the more the land responded, not in design but in companionship. Then the land opened up into a new space, vast circular, bordered by sentinel stones carved with spirals and echoes. This was no city. This was an arrival point, or perhaps an awakening place. At the center lay a single platform hovering above the surface like a breath held in stillness. They stopped at its edge. She turned her gaze to him. He stepped forward, drawn not by compulsion, but by rhythm. The platform responded, lowering gently to meet his feet. As he stood atop it, the stones surrounding the circle began to vibrate. Each one sang a different note, subtle and interwoven, forming a song that had no origin and no conclusion. It was a song of integration. From the platform rose images not of futures this time, but of connections. Lives touched by fragments. Worlds still struggling beneath the weight of forgotten resonance. He was no longer a singular vessel. He was now a bridge. The fragment within him expanded gently, reaching out in measured waves. It did not spread. It attuned. Across the stars, other presences stirred, some faint, some urgent. Echoes responded. Resonant threads began to pulse back. The network, once silent, now hummed. The Queen watched from the edge of the circle, her expression calm, hands at her sides, her aura dancing softly around her like wind made visible. She was not guiding this. She was bearing witness. What had begun as containment had now become collaboration. Her world had birthed a new equation, one built not from defense, but from inclusion. He lowered his eyes. The moment was not final. It was seed. The platform descended. The song faded. The stones stilled. He stepped down, and the Queen met him. They stood in silence as the light of the world shifted one more time. Not to darkness, not to brilliance, but to balance. Together they turned back toward the path. Behind them, the sanctuary hummed once more, not with urgency, but with memory. Before them, the world waited, not to be fixed, not to be ruled, but to be met. And he was ready. The balance did not signal an ending. It marked a beginning. Not the dramatic kind written in flames or echoed through ceremony, but one that grew quietly, layer by layer, like sediment forming beneath calm waters. The world no longer responded to intrusion, but to intention. The fragment within him pulsed faintly, no longer erupting or recoiling, but simply being anchored in rhythm with the place, with the Queen beside him, with the countless threads now subtly humming in the background of awareness. He was still himself, and yet not only himself. Something had widened. The city had become less a location and more a presence, its geometry adapting further with each passing hour. The air itself seemed denser with intelligence, with acknowledgement. Walkways curved not by design but by recognition of movement. Light pools gathered where thought lingered. Structures built themselves incrementally around conversations that never passed lips. He sensed now that the entire domain had always been responsive. It had simply been waiting for something to tune it into clarity. There were no commands, no new rituals, only alignment. The Queen resumed her presence at the center, but now she no longer carried the burden of custodianship alone. The weight had shifted, diffused, shared across a newly formed lattice between them. Her strength was no longer solitary. It resonated with his. Where she once moved as anchor, she now moved as orbit. and he once foreign, now pulsed like a native organ newly awakened in the anatomy of her world. At the edge of the central domain where towers no longer rose, but instead arched into soft vaulting loops of translucent material, others began to arrive. Not from portals or ships, but from paths hidden until now. Beings of uncertain shape and origin, some tall and armored in mirrored plates, others drifting like cloaks made of wind, still others walking with limbs that shimmered between matter and metaphor. None carried weapons, none spoke, but all recognized. They formed a circle loosely arrayed around the open terrain where the monolith had once stood. Now only the impression remained, like the outline of a tree no longer rooted in the soil, but whose memory nourished everything around it. The newcomers faced inward, but not toward him. Toward the resonance. Toward the bond that now pulsed between him and the queen, illuminating the ground in quiet intervals. He understood without prompt what had summoned them. The awakening of the fragment was not isolated. The pulse had reached beyond the atmosphere, beyond orbit, beyond the dimensions that tethered this place to traditional physics. It had echoed along frequencies not measured in signal strength, but in relational integrity. These arrivals were not diplomats. They were attuned entities following a harmonic event whose occurrence rebalanced their own realities. They had not come to speak, they had come to listen, and so he stood within their gaze, not to explain, not to instruct, but to emanate. The fragment within him, once a wild flare of potential, now radiated like a quiet star. He let it rise not to display power, but to share presence. As he did, the queen joined him at his side, her aura intertwining with his, their energies, weaving into a lattice of co-expression that lit the platform beneath them. The arrivals responded not with applause, but with reflection. Each presence adjusted its own internal rhythm, folding into the resonance, like strings being tuned in the same direction. A chord formed not in sound but in field. The sanctuary, the city, the sky, everything shimmered with it. They had become part of a new structure, not a hierarchy, a harmony. Time became spacious again. In this state, he saw the web beyond the web, not maps, not locations, but bonds. Connections between fragments in other places and other vessels, some unaware, some terrified, some already on the cusp of awakening. The pulse had reached them too. The possibility of resonance was no longer confined. And then inevitably came the question not spoken but lived within him. Would he stay? Here, within this sanctuary of light and balance, surrounded by those who understood not what he was, but what he carried, he could remain. He could become a node of pure presence, a beacon of sustained equilibrium. The queen would remain. The sanctuary would flourish. He could vanish into the pattern without ever being erased. But beyond this place, beyond this circle of recognition, the fragments stirred restlessly. Other vessels would awaken. Other worlds would misinterpret. Fear would rise again. Suppression would follow. The same cycle repeated across realities now wobbling on ancient fractures. To remain was peace. To leave was purpose. He turned to the queen. Her eyes luminous, as always, held no plea, no persuasion. Only understanding. She had known this moment would come. She had seen it from the beginning, not as fate, but as probability. She did not bind him. She never had. And so he chose. Not as a soldier, not as a vessel, as a rhythm. He moved to the edge of the circle, and the space responded. A path revealed itself, not lit, not marked, but present. It did not lead home. There was no return because the version of himself that left Earth, that followed orders, that expected mission parameters, he no longer existed. The path led forward, always forward. He stepped upon it. The queen remained at the circle's center, her form radiant, her presence unwavering. He felt her stillness behind him, not as loss, but as echo. They would never be apart, not in distance, not in dimension. The resonance endured. The arrivals parted silently as he passed their forms, bending gently in acknowledgement. No words, no gestures, only field. The path folded into color, into motion, into corridors of charged stillness. He traveled not through space, but through orientation, through sequence, through invitation. He became the pulse, not its product. He became the tether. And somewhere far beyond stars, in a world fractured by its own confusion, a new vessel stirred, half awake, overwhelmed by something ancient igniting beneath the skin. And there the resonance would arrive. He would arrive, not as savior, not as God, but as balance. And so the story continues not with a war cry, not with an explosion of triumph, but with a steady pulse carried from one world to another, echoing through beings who have yet to understand why their hearts have begun to beat differently. The balance was never meant to be a conclusion. It was always a beginning. A signal passed from silence to resonance, from fracture to harmony. Across dimensions and civilizations, the fragments now stir not to dominate, but to invite. And he walks among them still not as a name remembered, but as a rhythm felt. Thank you for traveling through this story. If you enjoyed the journey, consider supporting the channel and subscribing to hear the next pulse when it comes. New worlds are awakening. Stay tuned.